Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support. Please subscribe. Anne Boleyn's Last Day of Freedom. When you think of Anne Boleyn, your mind first takes you to the fact that she was second wife to Henry VIII. She was also the queen that helped shape religion more than 500 years ago. But she was also the first queen in history, the Queen of England, to be arrested and held in the Tower of London with charges that faced a penalty of death. You see, the 2nd of May 1536 was a day where Anne woke like any other. Nothing seemed to be amiss, but down in Whitehall a plan was being hatched by Thomas Cromwell. You see, it was at this point that Henry sent a message from Whitehall east towards Anne Boleyn, who was in Greenwich, at the Palace of Placentia, also known as the Pleasant Palace. Anne had started her day like any other, and she had even watched the tennis. You see, Anne had already experienced lots of drama in her first 35 years of her life. She had been a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. She had grown up in France, at the French court, and on her return to England, Henry had wooed her, and they fell in love. Anne had even birthed the future Queen of England, Elizabeth I. You see, normally when Anne watched the tennis, Henry would be by her side, but she was alone, meaning something was amiss. The day before, Henry had left in a hurry, something that was quite odd. It was at this point that a letter from Henry then arrived by boat, and Anne was left instructions. By order of the king, she was to present herself to the Privy Council. God only knows what Anne must have been feeling. Scared, worried, for an order to appear in front of the Privy Council was something very serious indeed. You see, although Anne is at the very top of the chain, other than King Henry himself, there were plenty of others who wanted to drag her down. History dictates that it was this point that Anne was no longer the match for Henry VIII, for he had been tiring of Anne, and was therefore looking for a new, younger wife. Nobody would speak in her favour, and no one would speak to her defence. Anne was then escorted from the tennis courts to a council chamber, and she was in full view of everyone. Anne must have been racking her brains, looking for what she could have possibly done wrong, but she would never have imagined what would come next. You see, Anne was then faced with 3 men: the Duke of Norfolk, who happened to be Anne's uncle, William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower of London, and a member of the Privy Council, along with a 3rd man who was also a member of the Privy Council. The 3 men stood in front of Anne and went, "Tut, tut, tut." You see, Anne was then to be charged with adultery with Sir Henry Norris. But Henry Norris was Henry VIII's oldest friend and most trusted courtier. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was another man she was charged with adultery with, along with a 3rd, but at this point still unnamed man. Anne then said, "I am the king's true wife, and no other man has ever touched me." She was then escorted by guard to her rooms, but again she was in full view. She was humiliated, and the gossip spread like wildfire. Anne's mind must have been spinning. Was Henry behind this? Was this a plot to destroy her? What was happening? Where had these rumours come from? I can only imagine how terrified Anne must have felt. Anne was then in her apartments under armed guard, and she tried to maintain appearances as though everything was still well. She then sat down for her meal, but her ladies were upset and tearful, and the usual waiter that is normally there every single day did not appear. Anne's composure then began to crumble, and she appeared distressed. What would happen next? An important thing to remember is the reason that Catherine of Aragon and Henry's marriage had broken down was because she, in the eyes of Henry, failed in giving him an heir to the throne, a son, and when Henry married Anne, that duty then fell upon her. And 3 months previous to Anne's arrests, she was actually pregnant with what they believed to be a son. It was at this point that Anne commissioned something called the Most Happy Medal, and it was made to celebrate the birth of her son. An interesting thing is that only the prototype was ever made, and this can actually be found in the British Museum in London. But shortly after the making of this medal, Anne suffered a miscarriage, and this miscarriage confirmed that she was in fact pregnant with a baby boy. This was devastating, a disaster, and it made Henry's doubts come flooding back. You see, he felt that God did not permit him to have a son, so he then began to look for another wife. Going back to Thomas Cromwell, Anne must know that he is surely behind this. Her accusations can only have come from one place. But what Anne did not know is that over the past few weeks he had been gathering evidence. Thomas Cromwell was situated at Austin Friars, and because of the role that he played for Henry, he was known as Mr. Fixer. And Mr. Fixer was devising his plan. Thomas Cromwell, along with many others under the employ of Henry, felt that the end justified the means. So Cromwell went across the city to Greenwich, where he ensured that Anne's net was closing in. Cromwell's first move was to have Anne summoned to the Privy Council, and his second was for him and a multitude of the king's men, loyal men, to enter the dining room where Anne was situated. One of those men actually included Anne's uncle, and it is here that we learned that loyalty in the Boleyn family to family meant nothing. You see, loyalty to the king above everything else meant a man's political survival. All these men came together in the dining room and they belittled Anne, but she held herself together. She was dignified. She said, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, then I am ready to obey." You see, in the past, Henry and Anne had been known to have a relationship that was full of fiery arguments, but they always reconciled in the most passionate of ways, and Cromwell felt it was his duty to prevent this reconciliation. You see, Anne's freedom had now gone, and she was now awaiting the transport to the Tower of London. It's at this point that Henry is still keeping a low profile. He is recorded as having not been troubled by what was happening, and he was reported to have been in great spirits and rejoicing at Anne's fate. Maybe Henry had already moved on. You see, an interesting thing. After Anne had been executed, Henry demanded that everything that was in essence of Anne to be removed and destroyed, and that included all of the portraits of her done whilst she was alive. You see, the Most Happy Medal that I have previously mentioned is the only surviving portrait that was done whilst Anne was still alive. Now, Anne had been awaiting her transport, and it was by this point that her usual self-confidence had diminished. She was about to leave Greenwich Palace, her favourite home, for the last time. Anne, then escorted by boat, was led by Thomas Cromwell. It seems that maybe he did not trust Anne's transportation to anyone else. Anne, then on the prisoner barge, was taken down river to the Tower of London. Cromwell and his men had spread the word of Anne's arrest, and the news flooded London. Spectators watched Anne, and the air was full of hostility. The journey took 2 hours, and by 5:15 Anne had arrived at the Tower of London. But she was no longer an honoured guest. She was now a prisoner. You see, the last time Anne had entered the gates to the Tower of London, she was there for her coronation, just 3 years ago. But now she entered via Court Gate, as she was still, in fact, the Queen of England. But as Anne entered the gate, she fell to her knees and protested her innocence. Anne asked the constable if she was going to be taken to the dungeons, but to her surprise, she was taken to the Queen's apartments. But this small act gave her a lot of false hope. You see, the case against Anne had developed fast and had got much darker. Anne knew at this point that she had been accused of adultery. But who was this mysterious third man? Rumours had spread about London, and George Boleyn, Anne's brother, had heard them. He was this mysterious third man. George tried to see the king to clear his name, but Cromwell had him arrested on the spot and charged him with incest. Cromwell's plot to destroy the Queen is falling into place. A summary of Anne's charges so far: adultery with 3 men and incest with her brother. Anne was under the watch of the Constable of the Tower. She was also being held in the Queen's apartments, something that shocked Anne, because it was not what she had expected. You see, the apartments that no longer stand would have linked the White Tower to the outer walls. But these apartments are long gone. Henry VIII had these rebuilt for Anne's coronation, but that was over 500 years ago. Anne is noted as saying that the apartments were too good for her. Was this an admission of guilt, or was it a clever plea for compassion? Anne is then reported as being hysterical. She was even appointed 4 ladies. But these ladies were spies for Cromwell, who had hoped she would then incriminate herself. Cromwell then plots his next move. But what did happen next? You see, at this point in time, Catherine of Aragon was still seen by most people as the true queen. So maybe Cromwell was using this in his favour. You see, Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton and George Boleyn, Anne's brother, the ones accused of adultery, were actually the only allies that Anne had. The trial would bring down her supporters, and the Queen of England would then fall. In the evening, Anne's mood is reported to have darkened. She was still insisting on her innocence, and asked Mr. Kingston, "Do you know for why I am here?" But Mr. Kingston replies, no. Henry VIII, who is then alone across the city, received a message with the updated allegations. He is distraught and sobs. But the question we find ourselves asking is, did Henry love Anne, or was he feeling sorry for himself? Anne now settles in for her first night as a prisoner of the Tower, and her mind was searching. Something that gives us a little insight into how Anne may have been feeling on this first night in the Tower is a letter that she had sent to Henry. In the letter she says the following: "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial. Let not my enemies sit as my accusers and judges, for my truth shall fear no open shame." Anne was asking for a fair trial, but is a fair trial what she got? No. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.